The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
Man, Judaism is complicated. Have you ever tried to explain some of our more, shall we say, interesting laws to others? Sure, most people nowadays, especially near where I live in New York, understand things like the basic idea of shabbos or kashrus. But what about sukkah, or kapparos, or hoshanos, or really the entire month of Tishrei? And you'd think by now we'd have a pretty strong grasp of all life has to offer. I mean, we have been ironing out these laws for thousands of years, but that is just not the case. You see, as technology advances and new issues arise, Das Torah has to determine how to proceed. And this week on the Jewish Living Podcast, we are delighted to have on someone who has devoted her time to studying this exact topic.
I'm Dr. Shayne. I am a graduate of UC Santa Barbara, where I wrote a dissertation on text and technology and what happens to the Talmud Bavli as it moves through different iterations of books into screens. And I really enjoy teaching and talking about the role that technology plays in the contemporary Jewish life, especially when it runs up with or against Halacha.
Dr. Shayne and I will be discussing the future of how technology will interact with Orthodoxy in some of the areas you may be familiar with, and others you may find surprising. As always, when discussing halacha on the show, please don't paskin anything based on what you heard on a podcast. These areas of halacha are much more complex than can be completely covered in a half an hour discussion. Dr. Shayne, thank you so much for joining us this week. So, in the introduction, we heard all of your little bit of a background, but I'm curious, how does one become involved with studying text and applying it to science?
So in my case, I started by trying to get a PhD in English literature, and as one does.
Yes.
And I discovered that there was a really interesting field called the digital humanities that focused on the way that computers were interfacing and working with the way that people read books or understood history. It's a fairly broad field, but I grew interested in it because of its relationship to books. And then in the process of writing my dissertation, I realized that the book that I was most interested in was the Talmud Bavli, how it evolved through the centuries, how important the form was. We talk about the transition from Torah Shebaal Peh, this idea of an oral Torah becoming written down and then becoming printed, and the importance of the first printing of the Talmud Bavli in, I think the first full one was in Venice in 1521, and how that changed sort of the course of Jewish history, because suddenly everyone, or at least every community, could afford a Gemara. And then it just kind of snowballed from there into questions of, okay, how do we learn today? How important is having a website where you can access Torah? And how does it change if I'm learning out of a sefer versus if I'm learning off of a screen? Do I feel differently about the text? Do I find things more easily if I'm learning them from a screen? If I'm using Safaria to find things that just aren't really on the daf itself, but I'm so used to learning from the daf because that's how I started learning Gemara. So things like that. And then after I got my PhD, I started learning at Yeshivat Maharat, and part of what we did there was talk about all of these halachic questions. And I was always the one saying things like, okay, but when it comes to Shabbos, how does an iPhone fit in? What about setting timers? What about, can you talk to Alexa? Why can't you talk to Alexa? Because on the one hand, it seems obvious that it's usser, but then there's this other question of, but why? What's going on? How does it work? And then once you're the one who starts asking questions about robots, then that just kind of becomes your jam. And everyone just is like, oh, Liz, this is a good question for you. And then that just kind of became my thing.
So just going back a bit, coming on my side, myself and my wife, we are both English majors, and we know that there is not a lot of income that comes with that stuff. So what do you do with your time now that you have your PhD? Are you learning full time now, or is there other things that you're doing?
I'm learning full time in a stipended program.
Okay.
So I'm currently being paid to learn Torah, and it is the best thing in the universe.
That's phenomenal. I wish. All right. So with that, let's get into the actual reason that you're coming to talk to us. Now, we know that this is going to be a huge topic, and I don't think we're going to be able to touch every aspect of your expertise. But we're going to focus this conversation on how the future of technology and even modern day technology plays into the Orthodox Jewish lifestyle and halacha. But maybe we'll have you back on to discuss some other areas in the future. I want to start with the concept of smart home. So you mentioned things like Alexa and Siri and certain technologies. So if you can give us a little bit of an overview about the why these things are us, or we all just take for granted, like, oh yeah, you can't use technology on Shabbos. But as you said, you're not only dealing in the practicality of the what, it's more of the why, the philosophical aspect. So if you can give us a little bit of a background on that.
Sure. So if you go back to when electricity became something that wasn't just kind of Ben Franklin with a key and the kite and the lightning, but actually part of people's lives, the rabbis very clearly had this instinct that this was going to be a problem for Shabbos, but they also weren't sure how. So there were a lot of ideas floated early on. Maybe it's Havara, like flame. Maybe it's Makaba Pachish, finishing something. Maybe it's Bona, building a circuit. There were a lot of ideas floated around. And as time went by, and also as rabbis began to realize that they needed some kind of expertise in the areas they were talking about, then my experience is that they started collapsing it down to sort of three different categories. So there were the rabbis who were trying to figure out what electricity was and threw out all these ideas. Then there's Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who wrote a pretty massive tshuva on the subject where he explains how electricity works, goes through what he thinks of everyone else's opinions and why he thinks they don't make sense, and then ends it by saying that it is definitely usher, but it's definitely an issue of derabanan as opposed to deoraita. So it's something that the rabbis forbid because of the way that it impacts the experience of Shabbat. So there's this idea, broadly speaking, of shvut, that you're supposed to rest on Shabbat. And Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that this is the prohibition that electricity falls under. Electricity is part of our regular daily life. It's something that we're constantly engaged in the same way that money and business is not technically one of the 39 malachot, but is also very clearly something that is asar on Shabbos. Going back to the Rambam explaining, if you didn't stop doing business on Shabbos, Shabbos would just be whole, like there would be no Shabbos. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach puts electricity in the same category. It's something that is so manifestly unrest like that we can't do it on Shabbos. And then most recently, Rav Asher Weiss, who is a gadol in Israel, wrote a justification for it being actually one of the 39 malachot, makabah patish, that he quotes Yerushalmi about how the rabbis tried to make sure that all of the things that you can't do on Shabbos fit into each of the 39 categories, and anything that was left over but that was very clear it was usher, they stuck into the category of makabah patish, because like that's the catch-all. So he says electricity also falls into this catch-all for the same reason, that we're not really sure why it's not okay. Like it's hard to put it into a particular category. Like it doesn't look like plowing and it doesn't look like baking, but it does feel like you're creating something, and so we're going to call it makabah patish because that's why that category exists. So that's sort of where we stand now. And the main difference there is that if you think that it's a deoraita, if you think that it's really a Torah prohibition, then it's really hard to find any scenario where it would be okay to use on Shabbat. On the other hand, if you think that it's a derabanan, if it's just something, not just, but just something that the rabbi said, then there are situations where leniencies might come into play. There we might actually say, actually, no, we should do this using electricity on Shabbat.
And when we say leniencies, we're not talking about the regular leniencies of Avataz Nefashos or health or things like that. We're talking about much less strictly required leniencies, correct?
Yeah, things like the lights in shul are off and there's a bar mitzvah and everyone's going to feel really bad about it. Can you ask a non-Jew to turn the lights on for you? Like, not in some kind of indirect, weird fashion of hinting or sort of maybe saying, oh, it's so sad, but can you actually straight up ask a non-Jew to do it for you? So if it's a if it's only a rabbinic level prohibition, then there is this concept of shvut d'shvut b'makom tzorach or shvut d'shvut b'makom mitzvah. So like it's a double rabbinic prohibition, asking a non-Jew. Electricity itself is rabbinic, and there's a real need or there's an obvious mitzvah that can be done because of it. Okay, then turn the light on. If it's if it's actually a Torah prohibition, then it's a lot harder to say that. Maybe you start saying things like, well, okay, how light is it if there's light coming through the windows? Or you might try to find a way around it. You might try to find one of the lenient sources that say, well, maybe we can use this in the case of a really important mitzvah, such as Kriyat Torah on Shabbat.
Right.
Maybe we could find a way to make this happen, but it frees you for a lot of situations where you're not sure how lenient you're allowed to be. Then you just have more flexibility because it's a lower level prohibition.
The other thing that this relates to kind of is the smart homes. So Alexa, Ring doorbells, those types of things. Where does this fall into that?
So there's something really interesting that happens when you start to get sensors and voice activated devices into the picture, because you add sort of another layer of distance between what you're doing and the electricity or technology's response. So if doing something electronically is already different than sort of doing it by hand, if you think that typing is less of an issue than writing, like taking ink and pen and actually writing letters, then suddenly you start to move into another territory when you get into the area of sensors or activation. Because it's one thing to say that you can't turn a light on Shabbat. You can't go up to the light switch and flick it on. It's another thing to say you can't walk down the street and someone else's house light goes on because it senses you walking past their driveway. So on the one hand, there are all these ideas about why that isn't an issue just from a halachic perspective, that things that don't benefit you and that you have no intention of doing in the first place are not asur on Shabbos. So that's fine. But it's really hard to say when you're walking down a dark road at night, coming home from shul, and the light sensor goes on, that you're not somehow benefiting from it, even if you don't intend to do it, even if you don't, even if you'd be fine if it didn't happen. Like, you still get some benefit from the fact that you're not tripping over your own feet and you can see the pavement in front of you.
Right.
So that becomes a really tricky area. Do you have to avoid that area? Do you have to try to not set off the light switch? Can you just keep walking because at a certain point, like, what are you going to do? There's no real, you're not in charge of the municipal lighting. And that's, I think, where a lot of contemporary rabbis are writing today. There's still a sense that you shouldn't be doing this stuff in your own home lechatchila on purpose, but things that happen. If you're wondering if your apartment building has electronic sensors that just track all the movements, are you allowed to walk down the hall? Yes, because even though broadly speaking, you benefit from living in a place where the alarms are keeping track of everyone who's walking by, narrowly speaking, you're not really benefiting from it. It's not really a major, it's not really a masa. It's not really an action in the way that we like to think about actions. So that starts to answer those questions, but it also raises a whole bunch more. Like, where do you draw the line?
Right.
What about electronic doors, which is another issue?
Now, when you say electronic doors, so there's different aspects of this. There's the ones that you have the key card, like if you have a hotel, or increasingly apartments are being built with those. Or as I mentioned earlier, just having a Ring doorbell or one of those smart devices on the front door. Now, they're a little bit different than what you were saying before with benefiting from them. Can I avoid them? They're a little bit different. There is the security aspect of it, but am I required now to shut off my Ring doorbell once a week?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because the question starts to be sort of, well, what benefit are you accruing from it being on from a security perspective? And especially sort of the conversations that we've been having recently about safety. And we might actually say that maybe in an ideal world, we would shut off a Ring doorbell, but we don't live in an ideal world. And there are safety reasons that, especially because you're not looking at it on Shabbos, it's just kind of working and doing its own thing. And we generally have a principle that our kalim can do malacha as long as we're not setting them on and setting them off. Like, we can set things on timers, that's fine. Then we actually maybe don't need to worry about it. That as long as it's doing its thing, the fact that you're passing in front of it, it doesn't really bother you to be seen on the Ring doorbell, but it also doesn't matter to you because you know you're going in and out of your house.
Right.
So that's one side of it. And then you get to the other side, which is the electronic door cards. And I know that I had family that lived in DC for a while, and a lot of the apartment buildings there were only key cards. There were no way to get into the building if you couldn't sort of swipe your key, and then the door would unlock for you. So that was a really big issue in that community for a while. And at the end of the day, the rabbi of Kesher, I think, paskins that because the key card isn't really doing malacha, that the electricity part is still electricity, but the opening a door on Shabbos is fine. Like, nobody says that you can't open a door to your house with a key, that because the electricity is not being used to do malacha, it's being used to do something that is mutar on Shabbat in the first place, then it's actually not a problem to use the key card. My Rosh Yeshiva holds that when you're in a hotel, you should tape over the door with masking tape so that you can't see the little LED lights light up, because you might be getting benefit from knowing that the key card worked, but otherwise you can use the key card because at the end of the day, what you're doing is opening a door. And that's not a malacha.
So let me see, because this seems like a little bit of a slippery slope sock. So let's say I take that and apply that to let's go big or go home, right? Driving to shul on Shabbos. All right. So you have your separate issues if it's a combustible engine. Let's say I have a Tesla. Okay. And going to shul itself is not usher to do. It's same thing like opening a door. And I'm not having those same issues of how a combustible engine works. I'm driving an electric car. Would I be able to use that same logic to make it mutter for me to use my Tesla once I'm able to afford it to go to shul on Shabbos?
Halacha, we should all have such problems. No, for the same reason that we already say you can't use a bicycle, that at the end of the day, there are things, aside from the fact that there are things that are Asar and Shabbat, and driving, transportation is very clearly one of them, in the same way that there's nothing, what is it about riding a horse that is a problem on Shabbat? And yet everyone knows that you don't do it. You don't do these travel-like things.
Right.
For the precise reasons of resting that we've already talked about. Once you start talking about sort of driving the car, moving it yourself, then you start getting back into the territory of masa. You're doing things. And the thing that you're doing is itself probably making noise, setting off lights, and not just sort of the same as moving your own 2 feet. Where I think the question gets a little murkier is if we're going to start imagining wonderful futures where we all have Teslas, let's imagine the future where we all have self-driving cars. Can I program my car at 9:15, because I am not great at getting to shul on time. So 9:15, the door opens, it waits for 10 minutes, and then it drives itself off to shul. And then the door opens when I get to shul. I set the whole thing up before Shabbat. Could I do that? And part of me is like, no, that's a terrible idea. And part of me is also thinking that for somebody for whom, for accessibility reasons, they can't get to shul because they just can't walk, then maybe this is the answer. Maybe this is the same as having an electric wheelchair. Maybe they can walk a little bit, but they wouldn't be able to walk to shul from where they lived. So on the one hand, it's not something that we might say, oh, yes, this should be available for everyone, because we still have, I want to say it's not Shabbosdik, which I think is a really strong halachic principle that got codified into Shvut, but that we understand, like, why can't you put the TV on a timer? It's not Shabbosdik. Why can't your self-driving car drive you to shul? It's not Shabbosdik. And as soon as there's some kind of tzorach, as soon as there's some kind of communal or personal need where somebody's accessibility is what's at stake, then I think we start to override Shabbosdik and say, okay, this is how you should do it. Because you could just tell somebody who can't walk very well, oh, just stay home all of Shabbos, and then you don't have to worry. But that's not really the kind of community that I think most of us want to live in. We want to live in communities that have space for everybody and where everyone can get to shul. So this might be an answer. Electricity might be a way to weave people into our community without making them feel completely helpless and utterly dependent on others to get them where they need to go.
All right. So before we move on to the next topic, I'm curious, aside from opening your door to your hotel or your apartment with a key card, is there anything else that currently exists, not a pipe dream of self-driving cars that may or may not exist by the time our lives are said and done at this point? Is there anything else in modern day life that this principle could be applied to?
I'm trying to think. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I know there's also something of a machloket about what exactly LED lights are.
Right.
That there are some rabbis who think that they are sort of just the same as any other kind of light, and that we should think of them as lo tavaru eish, like don't light don't light fires, or maybe because there's no heat generated, they're just a light emitting diode, then maybe there's something different. Maybe that which makes fire is the heat and not the fact that it puts off light. So maybe there isn't actually an issue with LEDs. There isn't a problem in having them go off. So that might be another area of stuff that's happening where we live now, that if you're doing something and the only thing that happens is an LED indicator light is turned on or turned off, maybe that should be fine. Or maybe that should still be a problem. So that also, I think, sits in that space of electricity itself is not the problem. It's that most things that we do with electricity are actually malacha. But as time goes on, maybe there will be fewer things that are purely malacha that we do with electricity. So I think, I believe that's Rav Nachum Rabinovich's position, and he is very much a dat yachid. But he's something that exists, and that when people, in the way that rabbis do, sometimes you really need a makel position because you're trying to make something really important happen, because there's either a shah hadchak, there's something going on that makes you want to be able to rely on someone. And I think the fact that he was there were a lot of great poskim who died in 2020, and he was one of them. And I think having that kind of godless behind a dat yachid is something that rabbis want to be able to draw on when they need it.
Right. I mean, we had right in the beginning of the pandemic, we had the whole controversy about the Zoom Seder. I remember that being an issue. I don't know if you had an opinion on that, or if you want to reminisce about that. If not, we can move on to the next topic.
Most of the people who I was talking to were like, I can't believe I have to do Sedarim by myself for the first time ever. How do I do this? And then frantically sort of trying to make sure that they had all of their minhagim in place. So a lot of people I knew felt like it would be more disruptive to bring Zoom into their Sedarim than it would be to do the Seder by themselves. I still feel pretty strongly that, and this is Rav Hershel Schachter's opinion, that if it's not an issue of someone's mental health, then Zoom Sedarim are asar. And if it is an issue of someone's mental health, then you should call them, and not just during COVID.
Right. Okay. That's a fair opinion. Let's move on to the other big topic. Well, actually, there's several other big topics, but the other one that we're going to be discussing today, which is the future of kashrus. And we had a little bit of a conversation about this beforehand on it. I'll let you introduce it because I don't fully understand it. So hopefully, I'll let you lead on this one. And that was just my whole prompt.
Great. So one of the things that I actually have friends who are doing research into, this is a little less my field, except from the perspective of I'm really interested in it. The question is, in the future, not so distant future, when we start to be able to culture cells from animals like cows or goats or sheep or possibly pigs and grow them in a laboratory and create fully lab-grown hamburgers or hot dogs or steaks or pork shoulder. Shoulder's really hard because that's a lot of different pieces of pig going on. What's the status of that meat? Do we hold that there is no way to eat it because there's no way to shecht it? Do we hold that it works if you shecht the cow and then immediately take the culture from the cow and grow it from there, because then we have sort of a principle that it's an already shechted animal and we can work with that? Or do we hold that it's some kind of davar chadash, the way that plenty of Israelis do about gelatin, that it is so far away from what it was originally that not only is it kosher and you don't need to do anything to it, it's actually parv. So like that's the wide range of possibilities. And there's sources kind of covering the whole thing that speak to one or the other, that like the idea of a ben pakua, which is a cow that was, or a calf that was born after its mother was shechted. Then there's this question of, okay, so what's its status? Does it need to be shechted? And we tend to fall on the side of, well, d'oraita, no, but d'rabanan, don't eat non-shechted meat, so shecht it anyway if you're going to eat it, things like that. And then on the other side, there's this really interesting Gemara. And I don't remember where it is, but I want to say that it's either in Shabbat or Sanhedrin on Daf Samach Vav, and it talks about the rabbis who would get together every Erev Shabbos and engage in some kind of mysticism and create a 3-year-old calf out of sort of knowing divine knowledge. And they would have that every Shabbos. Like, that was their way of getting fresh meat. And one of the commentaries says, oh, and by the way, that calf was pareve, because of course, any meat that comes from Shemayim would be pareve. It would be perfect.
Right. Well, it's also the concept of lo sevashel gedi b'chalev imo, and then this one wouldn't have a mother per se. So yeah, I follow the logic.
Right.
Okay. So we would be able to relate that same logic to a lab grown animal, or animal in quotation marks.
Exactly. But if you say that it's a davar chadash, then there's no reason to draw a distinction between cells that are cultured from a cow and cells that are cultured from a pig. Either it's not the thing or it totally is the thing. And then we end up in this weird world where there's some kind of product that's calling itself fake pork that Jews can eat, but then there's this other kind that they can't. Or maybe we're just going to decide this is wholly not within the spirit of kosher. So we're just going to treat all meat like meat, no cheeseburgers until somebody makes a really good fake cheese. Just forget about it, guys. This is not how we're doing it. So it's one of those things that's like on the cusp, and there are really good halachic arguments in every direction. And it's really going to come down to broader hashkafic questions, and it's going to be actually really interesting if the same thing that happens with gelatin happens here, where the Israeli rabbinate is much more comfortable saying that gelatin is a davar chadash and it's fine to use, and the American rabbis just really aren't. So you'd end up with this weird situation where every time Americans go to Israel, they have to make sure that their meat comes from an actual cow as opposed to a lab, which is going to make things even more bonkers than they already are.
I'm just going to be clear. It's not like the entire Israeli rabbinate, like every rabbi in Israel holds that gelatin is okay. It's a section of the Israeli rabbinate, or even if it's a majority of it. But it's not across the board.
It's specifically the rabbanut that paskins that way. And there are definitely Haredi and more machmir sort of kashrut agencies there that don't hold that way, which is why you end up looking around to get the gelatin with the right hechsher on it if you're trying to bring it home to America, which is definitely a problem that I've had a number of times in Israel. The question of, wait, is this candy I can eat? Can I eat it here? I think I've also had like minhag hamakom of when I'm in Israel, I'm going to eat the Israeli candy, and when I'm not in Israel, I'm not going to eat the Israeli candy. Just trying to negotiate that space of, okay, who am I following right now?
The other thing that people are probably going to be interested in, like, if you have any insider knowledge on this, how far away are we from this? Because everybody's like and when you talk about like when you talk about the possibility, even however remote it is, of having a legit cheeseburger, people are gonna wonder how far. For me personally, if there was one non-kosher item that I would go for right away, if like we were allowed one amnesty day, it would be a Philly cheesesteak. That seems to have everything that I want in one thing. So me personally, do you know of anything like how far away we are from this particular this question even coming up?
I was about to say, don't quote me on this, and then I realized we're on a podcast, so forget that. But my understanding of where the science is now is we can do hamburgers and we can't do it at scale. So people have grown enough meat to make a hamburger out of. But the thing about hamburger meat is it's pretty uniform. You need to grow the meat itself. It's not very good yet, because the next thing you need to figure out how to grow is the fat, because hamburgers are usually something like 80 to 85% meat to a certain amount of fat in there. And we're much further away from sort of something like a well-marbled steak, just because there are different kinds of muscle cells and fat cells that go into making a steak, and it comes from an animal that moves and uses those muscles. So you'd have to figure out how to make that happen. And also, at the moment, it's not particularly cheap. And in order for this to be remotely useful, it needs to be cheaper than the meat that goes into a McDonald's hamburger, because
Right.
that's what it's competing with.
Well,
So I don't think we're there yet, but
to be
right now it's a
fair,
matter of figuring it out.
to be fair, when cell phones came out, they cost, $1,000 for this giant thing that only go. Now you have these smartphones that you can get with a contract for a little bit. So yeah, it'll take time for the market to come down on it, but that's where science usually starts off. It seems like both issues that we spoke today about the future of halacha with Shabbos in terms of technology and the future of kashrus with technology is how basically it impacts the experience. How does it impact the experience of Shabbos? How does it impact the experience of keeping kosher? Is it with the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law? And that seems to be the connecting issue with, I want to say, anytime some new thing comes out. I know I spoke about this to you over the phone, but this was the question with turkey in America. When turkey became a thing that people ate, and the European rabbis weren't sure what to do because turkey was a bird they didn't know anything about. So anytime something new comes up, it's always going to be talking about how does this impact the experience of that particular mitzvah that we're trying to keep. Do you see, aside from Shabbos, kashrus, is there other areas where technology is going to have a major impact the more we move on?
There is a major area that we are not ready for yet, but that I think is eventually going to happen, and that is the artificial womb, which we're really not close to yet, but people are starting to test ideas of it with animals and starting to think about, like, how could we make this possible? So I think this is a pie in the sky, probably not in my lifetime piece of technology, but I think that it's something that is going to be worked on, and also already has implications because we're dealing with questions of surrogacy, and we're dealing with questions of the idea of womb transplants is something that is actually scientifically possible and that we might be dealing with right now. So what is the status of a child who whose parents, as in the people who gave that child their DNA, are Jewish, but they're born from maybe a non-Jewish surrogate, or maybe they're born from a Jewish mother, but the Jewish mother had a womb transplanted into her, and that womb was from a non-Jewish woman. Or maybe we're getting to this far-flung in the future area where women don't gestate babies anymore at all, and babies grow in artificial wombs, and then you open this, I don't know, I'm going to call it a uterine replicator because that's what it's called in one of my favorite sci-fi series, and and there's your baby. Does that baby need to be converted? Are they Jewish? If that baby is a child of a Kohen, are they actually a Kohen?
Right. And if they're not, can they marry a Kohen? There's all those questions. Yes. This becomes okay. That's a very interesting. And I know that for anybody out there, also Dr. Shayne here has a tremendous sheer on artificial intelligence and the future of that. Which this is not the time for it because we only have a certain amount of time for the podcast. But I know that you have this vast expertise on the future of that as well. Dr. Shayne, where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
So you can find me as Liz Shayne on Twitter and eliz.shayne on Instagram. You can also find me, if you want to see some of my other writings, then you can find me at lizshayne.neocities.org, and I will make sure that exists in writing as well, so that you can possibly give it to people if that's easier.
Yes, we're going to absolutely link to all of these in the show notes, and all of our social media on our show. We'll link to all of Dr. Shayne's social media and websites as well. Dr. Shayne, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us? Are you available for speaking engagements if people are interested in having you?
I am always available for speaking engagements. These days, mostly virtual, especially
which kind of fits in perfectly with what you talk about.
Exactly, especially because I have a 5-month-old, and that does make going places a little bit difficult.
Yes.
But I'm happy to show up and talk about just about any of the things that I covered here. And if you know of something that you think might be in my wheelhouse, but you're not sure, absolutely feel free to contact me.
Perfect. Dr. Shayne, thank you so much for joining us this week, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a ton of fun.
My thanks to Dr. Liz Shayne for joining us this week. If the last year has taught us anything, it's that we have no idea what the future holds. But it's comforting to know that there are people out there that are thinking about the future so that laymen like me don't have to. If there isn't an AI uprising by next week, we'll speak to you then. But for now, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sreli Picus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.